Hello, everyone. Can you all see and hear me without any issues? Excellent. I hope everybody had a good long weekend. I wish it's never long enough. I wish it was still the weekend. Honestly, I am I am tired. Just boy, it's busy. It's busy when you teach two summer courses. I can't even imagine what it's like to be a student in a summer course where, you're kind of going at twice the rate, and perhaps you have multiple courses. So yeah, Paul, I agree. So is my brain. Oh, okay. I feel your pain, Samuel. I remember those days. Oh yeah, yeah. I've been there too. Yeah, not on a long weekend. I did have a wisdom tooth out last summer or the summer before, and not fun. Yeah, food service is brutal on a long weekend. Hopefully if you work Monday, you're going to get that stat pay. I fell out of a canoe. That's what happened to me. That was fun. I was not in any mortal danger. Lake Nipissing is very shallow. I decided to go for to try my hand at fishing off a little point in the lake, but it proved to be too wavy to get there, and the waves kind of turn me against the waves. You're supposed to go into the waves, right? And these waves kind of turn me, parallel to the waves, and then it bloop, in I went. But because the water is so shallow, I was fortunate enough to be able to simply walk the canoe back to shore rather than trying to get into it. And my cell phone survived. I survived. We all survived. So, very good. That's never happened to me before. I've been canoeing since I was a little kid. Haven't fallen out of one until recently. So, not a bad track record. So it looks like we all had interesting adventures. Yeah, right. I'm pretty sure that broke the laws of physics. Um, where they're walking underwater in an overturned boat. Um, yeah, that I was like, oh, would that really work? We need to get MythBusters on this. So today, we're nearing the end of the book, of our textbook. So today we're going to cover the chapter on mental content. So, what are we talking about? Well, recall recall a few things that we've learned so far this term. Um, we've talked a lot about the nature of mental states. Yeah, maybe the boat and the pirates would have had to have been quite heavy for that to work, I suppose. Um, so, oh, hello. Boy, I'm just having trouble getting off to a start here. I'm now being distracted by my cat. Hey, oh, he's drinking my coffee. You're not allowed to drink the coffee. This is my cat, everyone. He likes to try and drink my coffee, which I'm pretty sure cats aren't supposed to do. Um, yes, this is Yo-Yo. Okay, Yo-Yo, sit down, bud. Got to get some work done. All right. Yeah, we've been talking a lot about mental states, the nature of mental states. When we're talking about mental states, we're talking about beliefs and desires, but other things as well. Perceptions are mental states. Emotions are mental states. I mean, really, any state of the mind can be or is a mental state. Um, and mental states are intentional states, right? They have content. So they're about things. They're about things because, as I say in the second point here, they represent things, right? So mental states are representations. I think I showed you a few weeks back Rene Magritte's Treachery of Images, right? Ceci n'est pas une pipe, and or this is not a pipe. And you might ask, actually, many of you knew, I think, the received interpretation of the painting. Um, but if you didn't, you might have been like, what do you mean this is not a pipe? It's clearly a pipe. Well, it's not a pipe, it's a representation of a pipe. Likewise, our mental states are representations of certain states of affairs. Like if my visual perception of this coffee cup is about the coffee cup. My belief that I am holding the coffee cup, my desire to take a sip of coffee from the coffee cup, all mental states, all representing things. Um, and because they're representational, they also have standards of justification and correctness, right? I can have incorrect mental states, right? I can have false beliefs. Uh, I can have poorly justified mental states. Again, when it comes to belief, I might have a true belief. It's great if that belief is true, but it might be a poorly justified belief. So, justification and correctness conditions will come in. They'll come in handy later. So keep those in mind because we're going to be talking about misrepresentation later on in the class. Um, so keep these things in mind. Another thing, just to sort of refresh ourselves on, is this idea that mental states, like beliefs and desires, are often discussed in terms of propositional attitudes. So if I have a belief that it is sunny outside right now, um, I can express that linguistically. So I can express my belief in a proposition, a statement about the world, with this embedded that clause, right? So Josh believes that it is sunny outside. So it is sunny outside is the statement about the world. And Josh believes that that's the that clause that describes my belief about the world. Um, so we want to know, how on earth do these mental states come to have the contents that they do? This is how Kim puts it. What is it about your hope and my belief that makes it the case that the same sentence, it is raining, perhaps one hopes it's raining and another believes it is raining, or hopes that it will rain and another believes that it is raining? What is it about? What is about this that? What is about that sentence? Um, or let me read. Still in weekend mode here. What is about these mental states that makes it the case that the same sentence can capture their content? We do not expect it to be a brute fact about these mental states that they have the content they have or that they share the same content. There must be an explanation. These are the basic questions about mental content. We don't want to take it as a brute fact, like Descartes took the interaction between immaterial souls and material bodies as a brute fact. We don't want to take the fact that mental states just have content as a brute fact, as a basic fact. That would be like saying, why do mental states have content and how do they get the content that they do? I don't know. They just do. Well, that's not very satisfactory. So we've got to try and explain things. Um, and keep in mind also that this is not just about human minds, right? Non-human animals have mental states. My cat, who you just met, who's now gone away somewhere because I wouldn't let him outside before the lecture. They have mental states. Um, they have to represent the environment, right? So we're talking perceptions and probably, although animals aren't, maybe animals can't really express the contents of their mental states with, language the way we can think of them as having beliefs and desires. We can attribute those to them, thanks to their brains and their nervous systems. So the physiological states of their nervous systems are content bearing, just as the physiological states of our nervous systems are also content bearing. So I can talk reasonably about my cat having a desire to steal my coffee or to go outside. Um, I could talk reasonably about my cat having a belief, right? Namely, that if he meows at me, I will let him outside, right? The cat's not thinking of this in language, obviously, but we can express the content of Yo-Yo's mental states linguistically, right? And we could even, I mean, I don't have this on the slides, but we might even be able to do something like this with artificial cognitive systems. Um, so you can talk about maybe like a sophisticated AI as having beliefs and desires, or perhaps some sort of robot as having beliefs and desires. Again, in this case, it's being implemented or realized differently, right? We're talking about computer chips instead of neurons. Um, but these artificial cognitive systems also have representational content bearing states. So, yeah, mental states. I mean, if you're a functionalist, those are mental states. Um, So, as Kim writes on page 228, these physical biological states have representational content. He's talking about physical mental states in humans and non human animals, not artificial cognitive systems. But it still holds true, I think, for some artificial cognitive systems. They have representational content. They are about things inside or outside an organism and represent them as being a certain way. In a word, these states have meanings. A neural state that represents a bear approaching means that a bear is approaching. So, what we want to know is how these mental states come to have this content. And how do we attribute content bearing mental states to other intentional systems like us? So, those are two interrelated questions that we'll be concerned with today. We're going to start off by looking at interpretation theory. So, what is it about interpretation theory that we need to understand? Well, imagine you are maybe like an anthropologist or a linguist, and you're researching some uncontacted people. So, nobody knows their language. One of your jobs is to try and work out what they mean when they say certain things. So here's how Kim puts that. Your job involves two tasks. First, interpreting their minds to find out what they believe, desire, and so on. And second, interpreting their speech to determine what their utterances mean. This is the project of radical interpretation. You are to construct an interpretation of the native speech and their minds from scratch, based on your observation of their behavior and their environment, without the aid of a native translator, informant, or a dictionary. And that's, of course, what makes it radical. So you're going in blind, right? You don't know what anything that these people say means. And you also, related to this, you don't know what they believe and desire just yet. Um, so you have to track a couple of different variables here. You have to track beliefs, and you have to track behavior, which could be physical or verbal or some combination thereof. And you have to track meaning or semantics. The only one of these variables that you can observe is their behavior, right? You can't read their minds. Um, you can't see inside and read the content of their mental states or work out what they believe. So, so what do you do? Well, you got to get started. So one of your subjects, who happens to be named Carl, utters the sentence "s regnant" when it's raining, and only when it's raining in his immediate vicinity. So you observe all these utterances, and you start to notice these sort of correlations between certain things that are going on in the environment in the immediate vicinity, and with what people are saying, like with the utterances they make. And so you've zeroed in on Carl here, who says "s regnant" whenever it's raining. So you observe Carl a little bit more, you observe all his companions a little bit more, and you formulate a hypothesis. You know, you've seen Carl says S regnate when it's raining. Hans says S regnate when it's raining. Gunter says S regnate when it's raining, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you formulate the hypothesis. The speakers of language L, which is Carl's language, utter S regnate at time t only if it is raining at time t in their vicinity. So that's your hypothesis of what S regnate means. And we've established this just on the basis of observing Carl and his companions, right? And then you can formulate some additional hypotheses. The first says that in language L, S regnate means that it is raining in the speaker's vicinity. So you've established, okay, we know, firstly, that speakers of this language utter this, make this utterance whenever it is raining at a particular time in their immediate vicinity where it happens to be raining. And so we can suppose that S regnate means it's raining in one of these speakers. If one of these speakers utters S regnate, that's because or that means it is raining in that speaker's immediate vicinity. And further, when speakers of language L utter this or make this utterance, it indicates that they believe it is raining, and they use S regnate to express that belief. Now, these are certainly plausible, but what is it that justifies your leap from hypothesis R to S and M? Well, it's your assumption that Carl's belief is true, right? Think about it. This is something I think we all take for granted because we're all such competent speakers, and pretty competent mind readers too. If I, maybe I'm on campus and you run into me and it's a nice sunny day, and I say, "Hello, student. Isn't it a lovely day today?" You would say, "Oh, of course. Yes, professor, it's beautiful outside." You probably don't realize it, but for you to agree with my utterance, you have to believe that it's true, and you have to assume that I believe it's true too, right? Like if it was a beautiful sunny day, not too hot, not too cold, the birds are singing, the groundhogs are running about on the campus, and I said to you, "What a god awful day." You'd be like, "Oh, that's a bit weird, right? Does Professor Redstone really believe that it's a god awful day, or is he being sarcastic?" Right? So it's this assumption that Carl's belief is true that justifies our moving from the first hypothesis R to the other two, S and M. That's called the principle of charity. So the principle of charity, is, as Kim formulates it, is that we assume, when we apply this principle, what we're doing is assuming that speakers' beliefs are true, by and large. We also assume that they're largely correct when it comes to making the inferences that they make, and that they are rational in terms of their expectations, in terms of the decisions they make. I've heard this principle put other ways, like assume that a speaker's utterance is as true as it can possibly be, right? This is something that we try to do. Actually, the TAs and I try to do when we mark student work, right? We also apply the principle of charity there. So, if a student is trying to describe something and doesn't quite do so correctly, we still assume like, okay, I think they know what they're trying to say. They might have made a little mistake here or there, but by and large, what they're saying is true, right? So that is what justifies your move from R to S. If you apply the principle of charity, then you can go from your hypothesis that these speakers of this language utter S regnate at time t if and only if it is raining at t in their vicinity, to the further hypotheses that S regnate means it's raining, and that when speakers utter S regnate, that means they believe it's raining, and they're expressing that belief by making that utterance. It's all the principle of charity that gets us there. Um, I won't reread it. I won't reread what Kim says on on page 231 here. I think I've already kind of said all of that. But do we get the idea? Excellent. Now, the same thing that goes for uttering S regnet when it's raining goes for all the other utterances that Carl and his companions make. And remember, this can be about things in the world. You know, Carl could make certain utterances that indicate that he believes it's sunny and that he uses to express that belief. But Carl could also report internal states, right? Carl, Carl might express that he has a toothache, right? Um, and by the way, applying the principle of charity does not mean that we're assuming that Carl and his friends are never wrong. Carl and his friends can and probably do have false beliefs, right? But we apply the charity principle to help us make sense of things. Um, right. I think you can kind of see why we call this interpretation theory, right? Because we're trying to interpret and this all works. Like, forget about Carl and this weird language that no one else speaks except Carl and his community, and you have to figure it out. We do this with speakers who speak the same language as we do, where we interpret their mental states um, on their verbal behavior. I mean, think of the Turing test, right? It kind of works along the same lines. So Joshua says, does assuming someone's belief is true mean that we are assuming they are telling the truth on the fact that they believe something? Yeah. Yeah. Like, so if Carl says S regnet, if you're applying the charity principle, on my understanding, what you're doing is you're assuming that Carl's belief is true and that Carl actually believes what he says he believes. So Carl's not acting in bad faith, right? But Carl could be mistaken, right? Maybe I don't know, somebody might play a trick on Carl. Uh, spray a bunch of water all over his roof, and he looks out the window and sees like water dripping down, and he says, "Ah, S regnet." But Carl is just mistaken, right? There, Carl just has a false belief. And you could say to Carl, "Hey, Carl, those guys are messing with your garden hose and spraying your house," right? So yeah, this is interpretation theory because we're doing the interpreting. Um, it could be, it could be. If, I mean, but that would depend on the behavior that we observe. Do we observe them worshiping um, an idol of a water god or a river or some other body of water, right? If we did, then our interpretation might have to change, right? So an interesting conclusion follows from all of this. Kim says, we can interpret and understand only those people whose belief systems are largely like our own. Right. This is also kind of Wittgensteinian, right? I think at some point in the investigations, in the philosophical investigations, Wittgenstein says that if a lion should speak, we could not understand what he says because the lion's world is so different than that of a human being, right? So lions perhaps have belief systems that are largely unlike those of human beings. Other human beings, though, tend to have belief systems that are largely similar, although that's certainly not necessarily the case, nor is it always the case. Um, on this approach, there's also not really any single interpretation which might best meet the requirements of the principle of charity. Um, that is to say, Carl's whole system of beliefs, his whole system of propositional attitudes might be by and large true. Um, but applying the charity principle isn't going to tell us which particular beliefs that he holds are going to turn out to be true, right? We call this interpretation indeterminacy. So to illustrate this, think of this example, right? You see Carl eating some raw spinach, and there are lots of different belief desire pairs that we could apply to try and make sense of his behavior, right? So we're applying basically the desire belief action principle, which we've discussed a couple of times before. So here's a couple belief desire pairs that might explain Carl's behavior. One is that Carl believes eating raw spinach will improve his stamina, and he wants to improve his stamina. So he eats raw spinach. I guess sort of like a, Popeye the Sailor Man sort of scenario, right? Or alternatively, Carl might believe that eating raw spinach will help him get rid of his bad breath. And he's been pretty self-conscious about his breath, so he's going to eat lots of spinach to try and alleviate this problem, right? That would explain his observable behavior. Or maybe Carl believes that eating raw spinach will make his mother happy. Carl's mother really wants him to eat his vegetables. So he'll do anything to make his mom happy, so he's eating the raw spinach. Or maybe his mom hates spinach, and he thinks that by eating spinach, he'll annoy his mother. And Carl will go to any lengths to annoy her, so he's eating that spinach. And so on and so on and so on, right? Because of interpretation indeterminacy, right? We don't know which of these belief desire pairs is the best explanation for Carl's spinach eating behavior. So what do we do? Well, there are a couple of options open to us, and that's where we will turn next. First, who picked up on the language that Carl is actually speaking? I think Kim should have used a made up language. It's not a bad guess. Carl is German. S. Regnet sounds Latin, doesn't it? It's not. It's German. Maybe Carl being spelled with the letter K was a bit of a giveaway, right? So, what can we do? Maybe we can apply the following principle. And Kim has this on page 233. For S to have the belief that P, so for Carl to have the belief that it is raining, is for that belief to be part of the best or most coherent or maximally true, etc., interpretive scheme of S's total system of propositional attitudes, including beliefs, desires, and the rest. There is no further fact of the matter about whether S believes that P. Oh, interesting. Um, Samuel, how do you say it's raining in Dutch? Do you know? Ah, okay. Yeah, Dutch is interesting. I mean, Dutch is actually a lot closer to English, I think, than German. But Dutch sounds a lot more Germanic, at least to my ears, than English does. Although Dutch is actually quite close to English, even though it sounds a lot different, which is really interesting. Yeah, I guess I have a bit of an interest in languages, although I'm not great at them. I'm not fluent in any other language. Ah, het regent. Regent, I think, because in Dutch the G's are like, aren't they? They're like a sound instead of a g sound. I'm gonna have to look into this later. So yeah, we can think of like if for S to have the belief that P is for that belief to be part of the most coherent interpretive scheme of all of S's beliefs. This reminds me of the coherentist approach in epistemology. in epistemology, I mean to say, where we don't think of knowledge as built on a foundation of some kind. Like remember when we were looking at Descartes, and Descartes has to establish, some sort of epistemic foundation to build all of his beliefs back up from. And he does that with the cogito, right? That's the one thing that he cannot doubt, that he knows if anything else, everything else could be wrong. He could be dreaming or being deceived by a demon or something. But the one thing he knows for certain is whenever he thinks or utters, um, "I think, I am, I exist," like that must be true, right? And all his other beliefs are built on that foundation. That's foundationalism. Coherentism is where everything kind of hangs together like a spider web, and there is no foundation. This reminds me of that because here, what needs to be coherent is the scheme that the interpreter is using to understand the other person. So what I need is for to understand Carl's spinach eating behavior is the most coherent and maximally true interpretive scheme. So maybe I know other things about Carl. I know that Carl actually has a pretty good relationship with his mom, and I know that Carl brushes his teeth twice a day, and I know that Carl is also a very health conscious person. He wants to take good care of himself. So I can eliminate, because I know these other things about Carl. Like I know that Carl believes that it's important to be healthy and he desires to be healthy. I know that Carl gets on really well with his mom, et cetera, et cetera. So I can eliminate this. I can eliminate the bad breath one because I've observed Carl brushes his teeth twice a day. Probably doesn't have bad breath. So it's got to be one of these two. And maybe if I'm fluent, if I get fluent enough with the language, I can even ask Carl directly, "Why are you eating the spinach?" And he'll just tell me, right? But here, the idea is that whatever scheme I'm using to interpret Carl's behavior, the best one has got to be most coherent and maximally true. And we can generalize this so that we're not just talking about beliefs, but we're also talking about other propositional attitudes, maybe like desires and so forth, right? And on this view, interpretation is actually constitutive of intentionality. It's my interpretation, like like maybe it would help if I read this quote on page 234. If the existence of beliefs is genuinely indeterminate, we would have to conclude, it seems, that beliefs are not a part of objective reality. Evidently, the same conclusion would apply to all intentional states. Intentional states exist, but they're ideal, not real. And that's a technical term. When I say mental states or intentional states aren't real, I don't mean that they don't exist. What I mean is that they're not part of observable objective reality. They're in here, right? And this is also called content irrealism. So if beliefs are not, or desires, or indeed all intentional states are not a part of objective reality, then that's why we say interpretation is constitutive of intentionality. It's not a means of determining what people believe or desire. It's something we attribute to people. So, um, I don't know. I wonder how many of you have read Daniel Dennett? If you've read maybe like The Intentional Stance or something like that. Okay, that's all right. Um, so Dennett kind of does something like this. He's interested in understanding intentional systems, but he understands them as systems whose behavior we can explain by attributing to them intentional states. It's not like he's denying that there are intentional states. Um, but for Dennett, it's like beliefs and desires are really in the eye of the beholder just as much as they are in the heads of the people we're observing. If you're curious to learn more about this, I would check out the intentional stance. In fact, I've begun marking your essay proposals, and I think for some of them I've actually recommended this as a source. Um, or maybe that was in a meeting. I can't remember. Again, summer brain. Um, all right, that was our conversation, Holly. Yeah, the intentional stance. Yeah, it's good. It's good. I like Dennett. I don't really have. Sorry, this is a bit of a tangent. I don't really have a favorite philosopher. And I kind of think the idea of having a favorite one is kind of always struck me as a little bit funny. But I do really like the work of Dennett. Nobody really philosophized like Dennett. Um, so um, let's see. Did I finish? Yeah, I finished everything on slide 9. So that's one approach, content irrealism. Another approach is content relativism. So on this approach, according to Kim, instead of accepting the indeterminacy of belief, we might hold that whether a given belief exists is relative to a scheme of interpretation. So whether Carl believes that P believes that it is raining, for example, that depends on the interpretive theory that we apply to his belief system. What does that mean, though? What would it mean for Carl's belief to exist relative to an interpretive scheme? Is it anything more, Kim asks, than the scheme the scheme attributed this particular scheme attributes this particular belief to Carl? If that's the case, how would we know whether the scheme we've chosen on which to interpret Carl's beliefs is the correct one? So there's a worry here that we'll circle back to this uh, that will lose our ground from underneath us, right? There's also another problem with interpretation theory, and that is, as he explains on 234, that interpretation involves an interpreter, and the interpreter herself is an intentional system, a person with beliefs, desires, and so forth. How do we account for her beliefs and desires? How do her intentional states get their contents? And when she tries to maximize agreement between her beliefs and her subject's beliefs, how does she know what she believes? That is, how is self-interpretation possible? Don't we need an account of how we can know the contents of our own beliefs and desires? Do we just look inward, and are they just there for us to see? Or do we need to be interpreted by a third person if we are to have beliefs and meaningful speech? Right? Seems like there's a worry of circularity here, right? I'm interpreting Carl, and I'm choosing maybe I can try and pick um, an appropriate interpretive scheme. Um, I could say that intentionality is in the eye of the beholder, but then what about the beholder, right? What about my beliefs? What about my desires? Um, how do my mental states get their meaning, right? So it's a worry of circularity, and maybe to avoid this problem, interpretation theory has got to deal with self-interpretation, right? So maybe it sounds like interpretation theory is not a good option. You might say, well, it's bad because some of these considerations will lead us to reject the constitutivist version of interpretation theory. Um, so I don't know. You're thinking to yourself like, oh, well, maybe I want to believe that my interpretation is what constitutes those intentional states, but then I have intentional states. Who's interpreting mine? Am I interpreting my own mental states? Other people are maybe interpreting them. And since they're not a part of objective reality, we can't say which intentional states which descriptions of these intentional states, well, not descriptions because we're talking constitutivism, but we don't know it. We can't know anything here. Um, and maybe you want to reject the relativist version because, again, the same problem arises. Like, how do you pick the appropriate interpretive scheme? Maybe you said, you know what? I'm done with all this interpretation theory. I don't like the idea that my interpretation is what constitutes intentional states of another, or that I don't like the idea that I got to pick and choose between all of these different possible schemes, and I have no way of knowing which is the correct one. I'm going to say that I'm going to opt for content realism. Here, there are mental states which are a part of reality, and interpretation is a means of figuring that out. Interpretation is a means of finding out about these states that actually exist out there in other people. So here, interpretation isn't constitutive of intentionality, it's an epistemological tool. Josh asks, so is the argument here that mental states are defined by their observation, but we don't know how we can observe our own? It's not really about observation because, after all, I can introspect. So, how do I know what I believe? Well, I'll introspect a little bit and think about my beliefs, right? A bit like Descartes does in the Meditations. A lot of what Descartes does in the Meditations is introspective. So the problem is not really observation or whether these things are observable or not, right? Because we can observe, I can introspect into my mind, and I can observe the behavior of others, either just, regular sort of actions they perform, intentional behaviors, we'll call those, or their verbal behaviors, their utterances. So it's not observability or lack thereof. It's where the meaning comes from, right? That's the problem. Where does the meaning of my mental states come from? So maybe you're going to opt for content realism. Interpretation here is a way for us to come to know about intentional states of others. So if I'm like a constitutivist, then Carl's having the belief that it is raining is constituted by my interpretation of his mental state when he utters "s regnant" when it's raining. So, and I'm doing all that stuff before, like it's raining. Carl says "s regnant," and I go, "Yes, Carl, I believe that you believe that, and I believe that you are expressing your belief by uttering "s regnant." All of that is constitutive of Carl's belief. But on content realism, I'm going to say no, there really is some kind of inner state there in Carl's mind, which we can describe propositionally. I can say Carl believes that it is raining because in his nervous system, there is some kind of mental state that's being realized by a series of physical events in his brain and nervous system that means it is raining, right? And interpreting Carl is a matter of figuring that out. It's not constitutive of his belief. It's a way for me to know what's actually there in Carl's mind, for lack of a better term. Okay, that's it for interpretation theory. Now we're going to get on to the causal correlational approach. Before we do so, are there any questions? Oh, okay, Josh. Yeah. So one is where mental states are giving meaning by interpretation, and the other is where mental states have inherent meaning. Yeah, I think you're on the right track there, right? It's not that it's not on interpretation that I'm given meaning. It's that his belief, all of it, is constituted by some interpreter interpreting that Carl has such and such a belief. That's the content irrealism version. Um, but yeah, on the other is like, no, there are mental states that are part of reality. They're not directly observable. I have to go through intentional behavior, verbal behavior, etc. But they are part of the world, and interpretation is on this view. It's not how those mental states come to have the meanings that they do, but it's a means of me finding out what intentional states a particular thinker has, right? It's all very abstract, right? I mean, this is why this sort of philosophy can be a little bit tricky because again, we have folk psychology, right? All of us are pretty good folk psychologists, right? Unless you have, like substantial problems with, uh, with how do I want to put this, right? I don't want to say problems with theory of mind because theory of mind might just be one way that we come to know the minds of others, right? Um, but unless you have a lot of problems with mind reading, we'll put it that way, you're probably fairly decent at knowing what other people are thinking and the things they believe, etc., on the basis of their behavior. Um, so you kind of take it for granted, right? How all of it works because you have this sort of folk understanding of how to understand other minds. But then when you look under the hood and you try to understand how does this actually all work? How do I attribute beliefs and desires to other people? And where do those beliefs and desires get their content from? Where do my beliefs and desires get their content from? That's when you start to lose that sort of folk understanding of things, right? Because it's the sort of thing that a lot of us are really good at without having to try. I'll tell you what, like I am actually not a very good mind reader. I don't know why. I suspect everybody's a little bit different, right? But I am not a mind reader, certainly. Um, I often, people will make a joke or say something snarky, and I will not recognize that, right? I can be snarky myself, but I'm bad at recognizing it in other people. Um, but even so, uh, I think I still have more success at understanding um, other people uh, than like a child whose theory of mind is not developed yet, obviously, right? So even when we're bad at this, we're kind of good at it. We're so good at it that when you try to think about how it all really works, you start getting a little like, "Woo, this is freaky," right? Now, since I'm still kind of in weekend mode, and maybe some of you are as well, we could take a short break before we talk about the next bit. We're actually making quite good progress today. Um, let's see. I have 320, 323. You guys want to take like a 10-minute break? Okay. So let's come back at 333. And in the meantime, if you have any questions about anything we've covered, you can enter them into the chat, and I'll address them as soon as we get back. All right, I am off to refresh my coffee. I will see you all shortly. All right, we're back. Uh, Maybe we'll have one more break before lecture wraps up, but we've got a few more things we want to get to. So we're going to look at the causal correlational approach. We'll call this informational semantics. So we need to imagine a scenario that Kim paints for us. First, think of our world, and think of a certain sort of creature that exists in our world. A frog. Now, of course, frogs have mental states. They're probably a lot different than human mental states, but they certainly have to represent their environment, to catch things like food. So our frog is sitting there in the pond, and maybe it sees a fly. Uh, so the fly is represented in the frog's mind moving across its field of view, so the frog can maybe identify or categorize it or perceive it, however you want to put it, as a fly. So they can eat it if it's hungry, say. So we're saying that the frog is representing the fly flying past it. The content of the frog's representation is that fly. That representation, that mental representation, is about the fly. Okay, that's pretty straightforward. But now you can imagine another world. And in this world, there are frogs, but they don't have flies. Instead, they have schmies. These schmies are not insects, but little tiny flying lizards that resemble flies in terms of their appearance and behavior. So this frog sees a little black speck moving across its visual field. What is it representing? Well, it's not representing a fly, it's representing a schmai. So what does this mean? Well, Kim tells us on page 235. From the frog's internal or subjective perspectives, there's no difference, we may suppose, between our frog's perceptual state and the otherworldly frog's perceptual state. Both register a black speck flitting across the visual field. However, we attribute different contents to them, and the difference lies outside of the frog's perceptual systems. It is a difference in the kind of object that stands in a certain relationship to the perceptual states of the frog. Further, our frogs, the frogs in our world, their perceptual episodes a flitting backs uh, involve a flitting black speck indicate or mean the presence of a fly. Qualitatively indistinguishable perceptual episodes in otherworldly frogs indicate the presence of a schmai. So one of the little assumptions we have to make in this thought experiment is that these flies and schmais are really very perceptually similar, or perhaps would be perceptually indistinguishable for the earth frogs and the otherworldly frogs. So a fly traveling across the field of view of an earth frog just looks like a little black speck. Similarly, a schmai traveling across the field of view of an otherworldly frog just looks like a little black speck. So that internally, qualitatively, the frogs are seeing just little black specks. Um, but what they represent, what each of the frog's mental states represent, is something different. One represents a fly, which is a type of flying insect, and the other is representing a schmai, a type of little tiny, superficially fly-looking lizard, right? In each example, the intentional states get the content that they have because there's a lawful correlation that causes an internal state, which serves as an indicator of either a fly or a schmai. We're talking actually lots of little law-like correlation. On Earth, light reflects off the surface of all kinds of things in the environment, and a fly goes past the frog. Light is reflected off the fly. Frog sees a little black speck. Same thing on this other world where we have frogs but not flies. Rather, we have schmais. And so the mental state that these relations cause in our frogs are caused because there are these law-like correlations, right? Law-like. There are causal. Oh, geez, my cat has turned on my captioning. How do I turn that off? Hmm. You know what? Maybe I'll just leave it on. Look at his tail. Come here, you. Um, what the? Oh, there. Ah, okay. Yeah, it doesn't look bad. Like, would anybody rather have the subtitles? I usually only put them on if there's somebody who requires them for like accessibility purposes. In any case, you can. I think YouTube has like auto captions, so once I upload the video, you can turn on the auto captions, and it works pretty well. Anyway, um, So this is the causal correlational approach, right? There are these law-like relations, and these cause in us certain mental states. And they might be phenomenally or qualitatively similar across different scenarios. What makes them what makes it so that those states carry different content or mean different things is not anything about the mental states themselves, but about what's out there in the world, right? Could we try and come up with some other examples? Well, it's all right. There, we'll get to some examples when we come to misperception, when we discuss misperception. I mean, Kim's example, Kim's examples have to do with like various um, farm animals in the field, right? Um, like I see a brown patch over there. Maybe I'm not even sure what it is, but if that sort of brown patch in the field is caused by a horse, then the content of my perception is that horse. If it's caused by something else, like a deer, well, then it's of a deer and not a horse, even if it's phenomenally very similar to, even if those are phenomenally quite similar to one another, right? So here's a schematization of the causal correlational approach. This is the informational semantics formulation, right? Subject S has the belief with content P. So another way of saying S believes that P. Just in case, under optimal conditions, S has this belief as an occurrent belief, a belief that you have like at that moment, if and only if P obtains. So I could say, like, I believe that that's a horse out there in the field. Just in case I have that belief, if there is actually a horse in the field and that is causing me to have the perception that there is a horse in the field. Now, note, this is restricted to certain kinds of beliefs, namely observational beliefs, or I think what some people sometimes call perceptual beliefs, beliefs you form on the basis of what you perceive or observe. There are a few objections to this approach, but I don't really want to go over them because they don't really raise any serious problems for this. I do think it's interesting what this says about qualia, though. Did you guys notice any interesting sort of implications for the qualitative side of things when you were reading through these examples? I think I've already kind of gestured at them, but I just want to see if you picked up on them. I mean, think back to the frog, right? I think this is where I really sort of gave it up. The Earth frog and the alien frog seem to be having qualitatively indistinguishable states, mental states, right? They each perceive a little black dot flitting across their visual field, right? It's so on the face of it, if you could know directly the frog's various experiences of watching the fly versus watching the schmai, those states would seem to be exactly the same. What differentiates them again is what is causing their visual experiences, right? Because of this, it's possible, or not entirely because of this, but it is possible that we can misperceive, we can misrepresent things, right? Mental states represent, sometimes they misrepresent. You could imagine driving along a road with some trees, and you'd be like, look at that tree, look at that tree. And, most of them are trees, right? Which you are representing correctly as trees. But then you might see something like this. This is not a tree. This is a cell phone tower that they made look like a tree. I guess so that it wouldn't, be such an eyesore, right? So you're driving down, and you might be like, look at that tree, look at that tree. And you might point to this tree and go, oh, that's a pretty tall tree right there. That's much taller than the surrounding trees. Neat. But it's not a tree. You've represented it as a tree. It is, in fact, a cell phone tower. So, and this can happen quite often, right? We misrepresent things um, in our environment many times. We did just as a fun example, right? In the early summer term, I was teaching philosophy of the paranormal, and we have a unit on cryptozoology, and inevitably we end up talking about Bigfoot. Um, or Sasquatch, as he was originally known. And it turns out, and this is something we discuss in that lecture and in the associated readings, the authors of the readings of the chapter I use for that lecture point out that many people who believe they have seen Bigfoot or Sasquatch are arguably misperceiving something else. And these tend to be either bears or like logs or tree stumps that are far away, right? What are some other examples of misperception? I mean, maybe it's happened to you where you have observed something that you thought was one thing, which turned out not to be what you thought it was. Yeah, like thinking a meteorite is a UFO. Oh, that's a good one. Yeah, sharks seeing surfers as seals. Yeah, that's a really good example. Yeah, maybe people think that's a bird or a plane, but it's actually Superman. Ah, okay. You thought you saw a dolphin, but it was a guy snorkeling. Yeah, perfect example. Oh, that's a good example, Leo. You're looking for chanterelle mushrooms, and you see those yellow leaves, and you get excited, like, oh boy, found some mushrooms, but they're just leaves. Yeah. Oh, really? Yeah. Maybe the way it was lying there would have looked kangaroo-like, right? Um, so this happens a lot. This happens a lot. Oh, that must have been quite surprising, Holly. Like, you think it's a rock, but then it starts moving. That's one of those kind of Yenshian uncanny sort of examples, right? That's not really something we have to worry about in this class, but for those that were with me in the early summer, you'll know what I mean. Um, yeah, that's another one. Yeah, that happened quite. That used to happen to me a lot, actually. I have a very good friend, one of my oldest friends. Name is John. My friend John. We've known each other since elementary school. He's a big guy, tall, really, really broad shoulders and beard, kind of long, kind of sandy colored hair. Uh, and he doesn't live here or in Ottawa. He lives somewhere else. But there's this guy in Ottawa. Actually, I realized he was actually a Carleton University student because I saw him graduating in the spring at spring convocation when I went to convocation. But I used to see this guy. I called him Ottawa John. I don't know his name or I don't know him at all, but he looks so much like my friend John that when I see him, I'm like, John? And then he turns around and I get closer. I'm like, oh no, it's just Ottawa John, not regular John, right? Um, it happens. All of this, you know what all of this means for our purposes is that, mental representations, they actually kind of have a job to do, right? Remember when I said at the beginning of the lecture that these mental states have justification and correctness conditions, so like different sorts of beliefs, whether they're the sort of beliefs that meet the criteria of knowledge, the well justified true beliefs, they certainly have justification and correctness conditions. Perceptual beliefs or observational beliefs, I mean, they have justification and correctness conditions. I can look at this cell tower and form the belief that I'm looking at a tree. but my belief is incorrect and maybe poorly justified. Maybe if I had looked closer, I would have seen that the trunk looks artificial and that it's growing out of this concrete pad and that it has these little microwave thingies, for sending and receiving signals and stuff, right? So if I looked closer, I would have seen, oh, it's actually a cell phone tower. So my perceptual belief that this is a tree is certainly incorrect and might also be poorly justified. Um, but mental representations are actually meant to provide correct representations of things out in the world. They don't always do that, right? And the teleological approach can help us make sense of this. Kim says this is where the teleological approach comes in to help out. The basic concept employed in the teleological approach is that of a function. For representation R to indicate and thus represent C, it is neither sufficient nor necessary that whenever R occurs, C occurs holds. So we've kind of dispensed with this causal correlational approach. Rather, to continue, what must hold is that R has the function of indicating C. Or to put it more intuitively, R is supposed to indicate C, and it is R's job to indicate C. Your representation has the content, for example, there are horses over there and not there are horses or cows in the dusk over there, because it has the function of indicating the presence of horses, not horses or cows in the dusk. So here, you might see a field full of horses and cows, the example which Kim is drawing on here. You might be driving near sunset or at dusk, see some animals in the field, and you go, oh, those are all horses. Well, actually, there are some cows in there too, but you can't quite make them out. Um, but that's because your mental state that's representing the horses has the job of indicating that there are horses, not necessarily that there are horses and cows in the dusk. So you can misperceive some of those cows as horses, but that's okay. Um, because we're not really emphasizing the law like the causal correlational stuff. We're looking at in terms of a teleological approach. So when we misperceive things, that's when representations actually fail to do what they're meant to do. They fail to represent the world the way that it actually is. But what is all this function talk, right? Why is this teleological? Do we do that? I thought we didn't do that anymore. I thought we were past Aristotelian causality and Aristotelian metaphysics, right? What is it that determines the end? Telos, that's where we get teleological from, or the function of these mental states. Most people today, and I'm one of these people, um, are naturalists. So they would explain functionality in terms of evolution and natural selection, which means it's not actually teleological in the strict sense of the word, right? Um, Aristotle would actually, if you could ask him, he would say that um, everything has a telos, everything has a final cause or an end. Um, Darwin's theory of natural selection was really kind of like the final nail in that coffin, because here a function or purpose, on the theory of evolution, is not like some Aristotelian end. It's just whatever confers an adaptive benefit, to the organism. Or maybe you can talk about evolution in terms of organisms or populations of organisms, or you can talk about it in terms of genes if you want to go the other way. But a function or a purpose or an end, like in an evolutionary sense, is not like an Aristotelian telos. It's just what works, for that organism, right? So, like, you could say, like if we want to keep talking about frogs, like, why do frogs have big, long back legs and webbed feet? Well, it's so they can swim. Well, sure, in the environment that we find them in now, but if the environment changed, maybe frogs would go extinct, or maybe frogs would all evolve into something that creatures that look more like toads, Maybe they keep the big back legs for hopping, but they lose the webbed feet, right? And then we would say, well, the frogs have the big back legs and non-webbed feet in order to jump, not to swim. Um, but it's not, again, like an Aristotelian final cause in like the strong sense. So when it comes to mental states, intentional states, their function is to represent the world. So mental state R's function is to represent C because R, as Kim puts it, was selected for to accurately and reliably represent C. It doesn't always work, right? Again, to go back to philosophy of the paranormal, which I know most of you weren't in, but my example is the Pleistocene era hunter gatherers who were out there hunting and gathering, and they might hear something and misattribute that noise to a living creature rather than the environment. And it's okay. Uh, if my mental state R is to represent the presence of a predator, and I hear a twig snapping behind me, and so I think predator, that's okay, even if there is not a predator. Um, because it's no loss to me, right? But if I don't have that mental state doing that job and there is a predator, I might get eaten. And then I will not be able to pass on my genes to future generations, and that's not going to be very good for me. That's not going to be very adaptive. So that's what we mean when we're talking about like function or purpose here. It's not Aristotelian teleology. It's not divine purpose. It's like naturalistic, evolutionary functionality that we're talking about. All right, any questions? We're moving at a good clip through all of this material. Let's see where we are. 16, I think. Yeah, we have 26 slides. So we're doing pretty good. Oh my goodness, I've gone right back to the beginning. So let's talk about different kinds of content, narrow versus wide. And we're not really going to be worried too much about narrow content. Um, I will at least try to illustrate the difference, but I think we're mostly going to be concerned with wide content. So, um, going back to the correlational account, the causal correlational account, it highlights um, the idea that content has a lot to do with what's going on in the world, what's going on outside the physical boundaries of the organism, right? Think back to the frogs, right? Why is the earth frog's visual representation of a fly and not a schmy? Well, because it's caused by a fly, not a schmy. But our alien frogs, although its perceptual experience might be nearly indistinguishable in character from the earth frog, it's not about a fly, it's about a schmy, because it's a schmy that caused that mental state in the alien frog, right? So to differentiate between these two ostensibly similar representations, we have to look outside of the bounds of the organism. And when we do that, when we differentiate between different representations by reference to these external conditions, conditions that are external to the intentional system we're talking about, in this case, the frog, we say of those representations that they have wide content as opposed to narrow content. What is narrow content? Well, Kim says we may say that the content of an intentional state is narrow, just in case it supervenes on the internal intrinsic properties of the subject who is in that state, and that it is wide otherwise. So, for example, if I wish I had an apple or something, but imagine I'm looking at a red apple, and that is causing my experience of an apple, then that mental state has wide content because it's caused by something in my environment. If I close my eyes and just imagine an apple, that mental state is about an apple, but it's not caused by something external to me. So that imagining has narrow content, whereas my perceiving an apple has wide content. Do you see what I mean? It's quite straightforward, this stuff. So let's have a look at a famous thought experiment that we've already looked at that argues in favor of content externalism, which is the position that which says that most, if not all, of our beliefs have wide content. So that's content externalism. And this thought experiment is, of course, Twin Earth, which is due to Hillary Putnam. I'll read it as it's laid out in Kim. Imagine a planet, twin Earth, somewhere in the remote region of space, which is just like the Earth we inhabit, except in one respect. On twin Earth, a certain chemical substance with the molecular structure XYZ, which has all the observable characteristics of water, so it's transparent, you can dissolve things in it, quenches thirst, puts out fire, freezes at 0 degrees Celsius, and so on, replaces water everywhere. So lakes and oceans on twin Earth are filled with XYZ, not H2O. And twin Earth people drink XYZ when they are thirsty, bathe and swim in XYZ, do their laundry in XYZ, and so on. Some twin Earth people, including most of those who call themselves Americans, speak English, which is indistinguishable from our English, and their use of the expression water is indistinguishable from its use on Earth. But, and this is the important part, there is a difference. Twin Earth water and our water, the words water, refer to different things. When a twin Earth inhabitant says water is transparent, what she means is that XYZ is transparent. The same words, when uttered by you, however, mean that water, that is H2O, is transparent. The word water from a twin Earth mouth means XYZ, not water, and the same word on your mouth means water, not XYZ. Now, can we see how this is meant to sort of illustrate this idea of content externalism? It's pretty straightforward, right? And don't worry about the fact that, like, what do you mean XYZ? There's no substance called XYZ. And, like, what are you talking about? You just made that up. Yeah, but that's not the point. The point is that, even though this is an imaginary scenario, when we utter the word water, it is in reference to H2O. And when we express beliefs about water, using the word water, we're talking about H2O. But the people on Twin Earth are not, right? They're talking about a different substance. And that shows wide content, right? Illustrates wide content. Well, yeah, Liam, I would say narrow is, I mean, they both have to do with mental states, but I think a clearer way of putting it was that narrow content is um, based on like states that are intrinsic to the intentional system, and wide content relies on stuff that occurs outside of the bounds of the organism. And in this case, it's the meaning of the word water on Earth and twin Earth. How it means different things. On Earth, water refers to H2O. On twin Earth, water refers to XYZ. Even though the word is the same, the way it's used is the same to refer to a clear, odorless, tasteless substance that you can dissolve sugar in, or boil, or put out a fire with, etc. So the meanings are determined in part by things that are outside of the bounds of the organism. It's really kind of related to the extended mind hypothesis, which Kim doesn't really talk about, which I'm also maybe not that surprised at, given when this book was written. But um, well, if you have any questions about the extended mind hypothesis, you can always ask me. But I'll try not to go too far down that rabbit hole. Uh, so just to finish up what Kim is saying here, we have to conclude then that the twin Earth word water and our word water have different meanings. Although what goes on inside the minds or heads of twin Earth people may be exactly the same as what goes on in ours, and their speech behavior involving their word water is indistinguishable from ours with our word water. So again, a lot like how the frog have very, very similar sorts of visual experiences, even though the earth frog's experience is caused by a fly and the alien frog's is caused by a shmai. Here, the way we use the words and what goes on in our heads when we use the words is indistinguishable, whether you're talking earth or twin earth. Nonetheless, they mean different things. So to summarize, people on earth have water thoughts and water desires, whereas twin earth people have twatter thoughts and twatter desires. I think I would have put a hyphen in there just because it sounds really silly. Like T water, twin earth water, but following Kim, twatter. This difference is due to differences in the environmental factors external to the subjects, not to any differences in what goes on inside their heads. So, what this really shows is that your past association with your environment fixes the content or the meaning of your mental states. On Earth, the word water is fixed to H2O. It means H2O because of your history of associations with your environment. You learned when you were young, when you were learning how to speak, this is water. And you didn't know that water was H2O, but you knew that this clear liquid that you could drink to quench your thirst was called water. On Twin Earth, they learned something very similar. They don't know it's XYZ and not H2O when they're learning this. So, but it's through this sort of history of associations um, with your environment that fixes the meaning of words, of intentional states, etc. Now, if this is right, it shows something pretty interesting. It shows that the meaning of our expressions do not supervene, at least not solely, on internal physical psychological states. So content externalism means that the context that the content of our mental states supervene not just on the physical states within the organism, but perhaps on physical states that extend outside of the boundaries of the organism. And if all of this is right, we can say that intentional states have wide content. Pretty interesting, don't you think? All right, any questions? I was thinking maybe we take another 5-ish minute break, or maybe 10-minute break. I don't know. I'm still stuck in long weekend mode. I haven't quite got back to regular teaching mode, and I apologize for that, by the way. But um, what do you say? Another 10-minute break before we finish off this series of slides? We only have 7 more to go, I think. Yeah, that's right, Lee. Mentally, I never left the lake. I'm still trudging through the water, dragging a canoe that is also full of water. And water, of course, means H2O because I'm from Earth, not Twin Earth. Twin Josh on Twin Earth flipped his canoe into XYZ and not H2O. All right, so I have 8 minutes after 4. Let's come back at 4:18. All right, I'll see you soon, everyone. All right, so back from a little brain break. Let's see if we can finish off these slides. Okay, so I guess we can sum up, as Hillary Putnam himself did, the notion of wide content with the phrase, meanings just ain't in the head, right? Um, they are, well, not completely outside of the organism, but content, as we said before the break, the content of intentional states supervenes on, physical states within and without the organism. But where exactly are they, right? Are they really just outside of the head? How are we supposed to make sense of this? right? Again, this is quite closely related to some of the things you'll find in the extended mind hypothesis, where cognition is not, at least not completely, taking place in the head. Um, I happen to think it's a bit of a category mistake to talk about things being in the mind or in the head. Um, Sorry, I just have to see to my cat here. Uh, oh, there we go. Um, but let's set that worry aside for now, and read what Kim has to say on these pages, 248 to 250. So where's the meaning? Well, we might say, Kim writes, that the belief that water and oil do not mix, for example, is constituted in part by water and oil. That the belief itself, in some sense, involves the actual stuff, water and oil, in addition to the person or her head having the belief. I'll skip this arthritis part because that's from an example we didn't cover, the arthritis versus tharthritis example that you might have read if you read this chapter. But the general idea, to continue, is that all the factors that play a role in determining the content of a belief ontologically constitute that belief. The belief is a state that comprises these items within itself. Thus, we have a simple explanation for just how your belief that water is wet differs from your twin Earth doppelganger's belief that twatter is wet. Yours includes water as a constituent, and hers includes twatter as a constituent. On this approach, then, beliefs extrude from the subject's head into the world, and there are no bounds to how far they can reach. The whole universe would, on this approach, be a constituent of your beliefs about the universe. Moreover, all beliefs about the universe would appear to have exactly the same constituent, namely the universe. This sounds absurd, and it is absurd. We can also see that this general approach would make the causal role of beliefs difficult to understand, beliefs as either causes or effects. So, the key takeaway from option one is that all of the factors that play a role in determining the content of a belief also ontologically constitute that belief. Your belief is not just, you know, a mental state that supervenes over um, physical states in the brain. Your belief is not just realized by your neurons firing. It's also the content of your belief is also literally made up by the things in the external world that your beliefs are about. What do we think of that? I think Kim personally might be, maybe he's a little harsh on this one. But I do see where why he is making the criticisms that he is. It seems strange to say that, my belief that there is coffee beside me in this mug is ontologically constituted by the actual coffee in the cup. Like that, this coffee in this cup is part of my belief, makes up part of my belief that there's coffee in this cup. That does sound kind of funny, right? I'm not the only one who thinks that, am I? I don't know if you guys have read any Heidegger, but this is almost like Heideggerian in terms of how it says beliefs are constituted. But you don't need to worry about Heidegger. I try not to talk about him actually for various reasons. One is that he's difficult to read. Another is that he was a literal Nazi. So, but what do you think? Any thoughts on option one? It is there. Is that what you mean, regardless of the belief? No, I mean that the belief is made up by the not just by it's not just an internal state. It also part of my belief is the literal object or state of affairs that the belief is about. Yeah, Leo, that's a great point. You could have beliefs if you were in the matrix or a brain in a vat. In that case, there's nothing in the world that your beliefs are about. Yeah. And also, what about dreams, right? When we have dreams, we have a belief, we have beliefs, um, and dreams are entirely offline, just like any mental states you would have if you were a brain in a vat. Then maybe what somebody who advocates for this first option could do is say, well, that's fine. It's just that now the contents of your belief are, fixed by whatever electrical signals this mad scientist is pumping into your brain, and those are part of the external world. So it's not like you can't offer a counter argument, but I think what the point you make there is a good one, Leo. Um, Lee says it kind of blurs the boundaries between the mind and the world around it. Yeah, it does do that. What I don't know if that's a flaw. I actually like. I don't know if I would take it this far, but I am a big fan of the extended mind hypothesis. Right. I don't know if my beliefs are constituted by the actual objects or events that they're about, but they're certainly coupled with them. If you want to read more about this, you can check out Adams and Aizawa's chapter in the, I think it's the Cambridge Handbook on Situated Cognition. It's called Why the Mind is Still in the Head. You can read a little bit about that there. Um, how could you have mistaken beliefs if the object is part of the belief? Yeah, that's another good point there, Paul. Like, how could I misperceive a horse? I see there's a cow in the field at dusk, and I misperceive it as a horse. Well, now how am I misperceiving the horse or the cow? Uh, if the cow, like I say, oh, I believe there's a horse in the field, but my belief is partially constituted by a cow that I'm misperceiving. That's a little hard to make sense of, right? Um, so yeah, that's a really good point, Paul. Okay, so interesting thoughts when it comes to option one. What about option two? Um, we might consider the belief that oil and water do not mix as a relation holding between the subject on the one hand and water and oil on the other. Or alternatively, we can take the belief as a relational property of the subject involving water and oil. Or, to talk about different example, Socrates and Xantippe, right? That Socrates is married to Xantippe is a relational fact. Socrates also has the relational property of being married to Xantippe, and conversely, Xantippe has the relational property of being married to Socrates. Similarly, there are relations or relational properties that hold between me, water, and oil. And maybe those are what form my belief or constitute my belief, right? It's not the objects themselves, but the relational properties that hold between all of them, between the intentional system and what their intentional states are about. To continue, this approach makes causation of beliefs more tractable. We can ask, and will sometimes be able to answer, how a subject came to bear this belief in relation to water and oil, just as we can ask how Xanthippe came to have the relational property of being married to Socrates. But what of the other determinants of contents? As we saw, belief content is determined in part by the history of one's interaction with one's environment. And what of the sociolinguistic determinants, as in Burge's examples? It seems at least awkward to consider beliefs as relations with respect to these factors. Burge's example, I guess we better talk about it, is the arthritis versus arthritis example. There's a case where someone, I don't remember his name. I think it's Paul, but maybe he says I have arthritis, and he mistakenly thinks that arthritis is inflammation of the bones rather than inflammation of the joints. So he goes to the doctor and he thinks he has arthritis in his thigh, but he doesn't. But we can imagine a world where there is such a condition where we'd have to differentiate between inflammation of the bones and inflammation of the joints. So we call them arthritis and arthritis. Um, and the meaning of that term is fixed again by this relation, between Paul and the world, where in his world you can have inflammation of the bones called arthritis, right? I don't know. What do we think of this relation or relational properties approach? I certainly think it makes things a lot more manageable. right? But what do you think? So here it's not the objects of my belief that partially constitute belief, but relational properties that hold between the believer and the objects of their belief. So my belief that there's a coffee cup here beside me on this little island that I'm teaching on isn't ontologically constituted by the coffee cup, but there are relational properties, right? There's coffee and it's in a cup, and that cup is on this surface, and I am beside the coffee cup. So it's not the objects themselves, but the properties. You see how that makes things a little clearer, right? A little more manageable. I don't know. What do we think? Yeah, Lee. Makes more sense to Lee. That's good. Anyone else? Holly agrees. Excellent. What about the third possibility? Well, that possibility, Kim says, is to consider beliefs to be wholly internal to the subjects who have them, but consider their contents when they are wide as giving relational specifications or descriptions of the contents. On this view, beliefs may be neural states or other types of physical states of organisms to which they are attributed, and as such, they are in the believer's head or mind. Contents, then, are construed as ways of specifying or describing the representational properties of these states. Wide contents are thus specifications in terms that involve factors and conditions external to the subject, both physical and social, both current and historical. We can refer to or pick out Socrates by relational descriptions, that is, in terms of his relational properties. For example, the husband of Xanthippe, the Greek philosopher who drank hemlock in a prison in Athens, Plato's mentor, and so on. But this does not mean that Xanthippe, hemlock, or Plato is a constituent part of Socrates, nor does it mean that Socrates is in some kind of a relational entity. Similarly, when we specify Jones's belief as the belief that water and oil do not mix, we are specifying this belief relationally by reference to water and oil, but this does not mean that water and oil are constituents of the belief or that the belief itself is a relation to water and oil. Kim says this is the most promising approach. I don't know. I'm happy with number two. But sure, this could work too. Again, speaking personally, I do think it's a category mistake to talk about mental states being in a mind. I'm kind of going with like Gilbert Ryle and Daniel Dennett here. The mind is not a container. The mind is a system. Um, for something to be in the mind is for something to be occurring in mind, not for it to be like actually in a place, right? Um, so I don't really have a problem with approach number two, but you might find this approach a little bit more palatable. So wide contents, when our belief have wide contents, they're giving these descriptions or relational specification. The objects themselves do not constitute the belief. The relational properties between the objects and the believer do not constitute the belief. Instead, um, this is just a way of describing contents of beliefs. Um, what do you think? Do you like number two or number three better? Just from what I've told you today, and no wrong answers. I'm just curious how this is sitting with all of you. Holly's processing. That's fair. I mean, I think, yeah, like I said, I kind of share some of Kim's concerns with option number one. If you need to take a little bit more time to sort out whether you're a fan of option two or option three, that's totally fine, right? I just want to make sure you understand the difference. On the first approach, the objects of belief literally constitute the belief. Option number two, it's the relational properties. And on option number three, neither of these are constitutive of belief. It's rather wide contents are, they give us these descriptions. We're going to skip over the part on whether narrow content is possible. I think it's like the thing is narrow content is obviously possible. I think you can imagine, you can dream, right? Uh, these are mental states with narrow content. The question is really like how much of it is wide and how much of it is narrow. That's really what this is about, right? Is all content wide? Probably not. Is all content narrow? Probably not. But that's all I really have to say about that question today. Let's look at some problems for content externalism. So here, the little bit in Kim's chapter is called the causal. Oh, excuse me. The causal explanatory efficacy of wide content. On 254, Kim writes, even if we acknowledge that common sense psychology individuates intentional states widely and formulates causal explanations of behavior in terms of wide content states, we might well ask whether this is an eliminable feature of such explanations. Like, do we need these kind of explanations? Or could we maybe make our theory simpler by getting rid of them? Um, so think again of twin Earth. Um, Water thoughts, the people who live on Earth have water thoughts, and the people that live on twin Earth have twatter thoughts. But these thoughts are not really different in terms of what kind of behavior they generate. If somebody on twin Earth is thirsty and has a desire to satisfy that thirst and believes they can do so by drinking some water, they're going to do that, even though water on twin Earth refers to XYZ rather than H2O as it does on Earth. So the behavior isn't any different, even though the content is wide, um, and water means something different on Earth than it does on twin Earth. So if you're a psychologist and you go and visit twin Earth, right, you don't have to rebuild your psychology from scratch. All you need to do is keep in mind that on twin Earth, water refers to XYZ, and on Earth, water refers to H2O. In view of this, Kim says, isn't it more appropriate to take the difference between water thoughts and twatter thoughts, or water desires and twatter desires, merely as a difference in the values of a contextual parameter fixed to suit the situation to which the theory is applied, rather than as an integral element of the theory itself? If this is correct, doesn't wide content drop out as part of the theoretical apparatus of psychological theory? Right? What Kim is saying is like, look, if I have a theory like I'm a little folk psychologist traveling to Twin Earth, I don't have to change anything. I just have to remember that water refers to XYZ on twin Earth. I just have to change that one little parameter, not anything else about my theory. So if I see somebody going, oh, I'm parched, and then they run to the sink and take a big gulp of water, um, yeah, sure, water means XYZ, but me as a visitor from Earth, I can still go, oh, they were really thirsty, weren't they? Right? You see how this works. So maybe wide content, like, who cares? Maybe we don't need to worry about wide content if, in our psychological theorizing. What do you think? I'm trying to get discussion going to fill out the rest of the lecture because I feel like with the two breaks we've taken, maybe we'll finish a little too early. So yeah, what are your thoughts on this idea? Like, okay, well, why is wide content important, right? It's not really important with respect to our theory because the theory doesn't change. We can just think of wide content as specifying like little parameters we might have to tweak, not anything we have to like substantially change about our folk psychological theory. That's okay. Yeah, Paul's absorbing, Holly's absorbing. Uh, that's all right, guys. I get it. We're getting the end of the summer and it's busy. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. I hope you feel better soon. Well, Josh says, this is what I was thinking. If they're virtually indistinguishable except for the H2O versus XYZ, then should it not really matter when looking at mental content? I mean, I wouldn't say it doesn't matter at all. It's still relevant that our mental states and our utterances refer to different things. Um, but yeah, but does that really make a big difference for our psychological theorizing? Maybe it doesn't, right? Samantha, I get it. Yeah. Um, Yeah, like wow, that's a long day. Yeah. I get okay. Well, maybe we'll just go ahead and finish early. It's okay, everybody. It's all right. Okay, so Holly, yeah, Holly, you got it. Maybe, yeah, doesn't make a difference for psychological theorizing. And as Liam puts it, yeah, maybe wide content is just contextualizing narrow. Yeah, I see what you're saying there. Like maybe all content is narrow in the sense that it's really just in the head, but we're we're contextualizing it. That sounds like option three, basically, that we looked at a few moments ago. There are also some interesting metaphysical considerations here. Think about something like this: the proximal causes of actions, like when you raise your arm, are local. They come from inside of the agent. Remember, we talked about agents as agents are agents because they act. They perform actions on the basis of reasons. So if you decide to raise your arm, that's your reason. You have a reason for doing that. That's what caused you to raise it. It comes from inside, for lack of a better term. What neural events represent outside is here it is argued irrelevant to behavior causation. I'm not sure if I agree with this, but if the same neural event were to occur in a different environment, such that it had different wide content, this is the point. It would still cause me to raise your arm. So when you decide I'm going to raise my arm and you raise it, great. Um, there could be some other environment where maybe the content of your beliefs and desires that cause you to raise your arm are wide, not narrow. That makes no difference in terms of behavior. So, if this is correct, the proximate cause of behavior supervenes locally on your internal physical states, but wide content states, Kim writes, are not so supervenient. So, this is a fancy way of saying that the wideness of wide content mental states doesn't really matter for us in terms of causally explaining behavior. I guess you can respond by pointing out that when we're being folk psychologists, when we're applying folk psychological explanations, we're doing it for actions, right? Not happenings, not mere physical behavior. Behaviors, Kim writes, explained in typical common sense explanations are given under wide descriptions, and we need wide content states to explain them. So the point of the reply is that we need wide content to explain wide behavior. Because it's not often just the case that every action originates solely from within you, right? Yeah, Liam. Yeah, I see what you're saying. Like it follows from three or works with three because again, three is really more like emphasizing means of describing, um, making sense of what mental states mean, not talking about objects, events, or relational properties as being constitutive of the meaning, right? So if that's what you're saying, then yes, I think I agree with you there. So if we have so a lot of explanations are given under wide descriptions. You can see this, right? Like if I desire to have a drink of water, sure, there's going to be states that have narrow content, like, oh, I seems to me I am quite thirsty, right? That like if I believe that I am thirsty and I have the sensation of a dry throat, right? Those are mental states with narrow content, but that's not what that's not the only thing that figures into my behavior, right? I also have beliefs that there could be water in the fridge or water from the tap, and I have beliefs about where those things are, and those seem to have wide content. Um, so, to get a full explanation of my wide behavior, we need the wide content. That's the argument, right? Um, how about wide content and self-knowledge? So again, twin Earth. Imagine Mary. We have Mary on Earth and Mary's twin on twin Earth. How do we know that Mary believes that water is wet and that Mary's twin on twin Earth believes that twatter is wet? Because we know that Mary's environment contains water and that Mary's twin environment contains water. Now consider the matter from Mary's point of view. How does she know that she believes water is wet? How does she know the content of her own thoughts? Okay. So, well, again, from what I'm saying, like if in number one, the objects that our mental states are about are also constitutive of those mental states. When it comes to option two, it's not the objects, but the relational properties between the objects that obtain. So if I am an intentional system and I have the belief that water and oil do not mix, it's not that water and oil themselves constitute my belief, but the relational properties between water and oil and me constitute the belief. So we're talking about properties rather than objects. That's how I understand. That's my reading of it. Okay, so Twin Earth. Yeah, well, Mary on Earth believes water is wet. Mary on Twin Earth believes twatter is wet, even though she'd use the word water and not twatter. And she'd be referring to XYZ and not H2O. So a key feature of mentality is that we have sort of, at least it seems to us that we have direct access to our own occurrent mental states. I left that out of the slides, but I think Kim does specify that in the text. I have direct access to occurrent mental states that are like occurring to me right now. It's not going to be perfect, right? There's plenty going on in my mind that I do not have direct access to. I do not have direct access to anything that's going on in my unconscious mind, which is why it's unconscious, right? So this access is not perfect, but we could say, I think, in a way that would satisfy most people, that my own mind is known to me more or less directly. Your minds are not, right? I have to look at intentional behavior and verbal behavior. I can't directly access your mind, right? So let's think back to Mary. It seems plausible to think that in order for Mary to know, Kim writes, that her thought is about water and not twatter, she is in the same epistemic situation that we are with respect to the content of her thought. How can Mary know that her thought is about water as H2O and not as XYZ? We know her thoughts are about water because on Earth, water refers to H2O, and H2O is what fills the rivers, lakes, and oceans on Earth. But Mary, uh, does Mary know that? I think Mary knows that. Why doesn't she too have to know that she is to know that her thought is about water, not twatter? And how can she know something like that without observational or evidence? Is this really a worry, though? I don't know. I guess maybe Mary is in danger of losing this privileged epistemic access. I don't know if I buy this worry, though. I mean, at least if you ask somebody who's reasonably informed about the makeup of the world as we know it. Like all of you know that you're on this earth and that water is H2O on this earth. So you know that your water thoughts and your water utterances are about water. Um, so I don't understand the worry here. I mean, Kim writes that the reason why she's in danger of losing this privileged access is because her knowledge of her thoughts' contents is now on the same footing as third person knowledge of her thoughts' contents. So it's like Mary's knowledge of her own mind is no longer special. I think that's what Kim is trying to illustrate here. No longer special as in privileged. Uh, but then again, yeah, I don't. I'm not going to deny that the contents of our own minds are privileged, but we certainly don't have as perfect access to our own mental states as Kim and some others seem to be saying. So I don't know. Maybe that's why I don't find this so worrisome. Like, oh no, the content of my mental states aren't as privileged. I don't have access that's as privileged as I thought I did. You still have more access, more direct access to them than other people do. I mean, I don't know. This is just a weird way to illustrate this worry, maybe. I don't know. I'm not trying to be harsh, not trying to be critical of Cam. I just don't get this worry. This doesn't worry me that much. You may disagree with me though. Feel free to absolutely disagree with me. Samantha doesn't feel like it's a worry. Leo says even if her belief is mistaken, she still has direct access to the fact that she has that belief. Yeah. Maybe that's what we have the special access to rather than the content. Because I don't know, it just seems to me like I am a philosophically and scientifically literate individual. So, and I know that on Earth, water means H2O. So, like, yeah, that doesn't change my privileged access to my mental states. Um, yeah. But maybe we can clarify this by imagining that Mary can travel to Twin Earth. Maybe Twin Earth isn't really that far away and she can take a spaceship. Maybe she has a Star Trek transporter device, or maybe she has like a Rick and Morty style portal gun or something, right? And she can easily get there. After a while, she forgets which planet she is on. So now, can Mary know directly and without further investigation whether her thoughts are about water or twatter? Well, if we imagine that she could travel back and forth between Twin Earth and she does this so much that she forgets what planet she's on, then we could imagine that she cannot know, um, at least without any further evidence or investigation, like asking somebody, hey, is this Twin Earth or my Earth? Right? So if that's right, content externalism entails that a lot of our self-knowledge isn't direct at all. Like other kinds of knowledge, it's got to be based on evidence. Yeah, okay, fine. I'm okay with that. Content externalism, Kim continues, appears to be prima facie incompatible with privileged first person access to one's mind. Uh, I'm just not impressed by that claim. No, I disagree. I like, look, don't get me wrong. Kim, awesome philosopher. Uh, I just don't agree with this. And you don't have to listen to me, right? You might agree with Kim, you might agree with me. I'm not here to tell you what to believe. I'm here to teach you how to think. But to me, like, yeah, I don't think our self-knowledge is that direct. I mean, does even my own inner states that represent the contents of my own mind, I don't think do a very good job of representing what's actually going on in my head. They do a good enough job. Again, because I'm like a naturalist. This all of this stuff is evolved. It does it. All of this stuff does a good enough job to keep me alive. Beyond that, yeah, why should I expect it to give me direct, special, perfectly accurate information about my own mind? It doesn't. Hell, this is why people go to therapy, right? You ever talk to a therapist and they make you realize, like, hey, I think this is what's happening. And you're like, oh, I didn't even realize that. Well, yeah, because you don't have this privileged, direct, perfect access to your own mind. If you did, nobody would go to therapy. Yeah. The claim is on page 257, Liam. Content externalism appears to be prima facie incompatible with privileged first person access. So what? Right? Like maybe I don't disagree with this and I'm just like I don't care. And Holly says, like, we're wrong a lot. We're wrong about our own mental states a lot. Yeah. Fair enough, Paul. I mean, I think Kim is coming. And again, this is not meant to be like a very negative criticism, but I think Kim is working from this perspective of like cognitive virtue, right? Where humans are rational and humans have direct privileged access to their own mental states. Humans understand their own minds. Um, yeah, I think we kind of do, but not in the way that, at least in like in modern and contemporary philosophy, Western philosophy, not in this way. I actually think our minds mislead us about a lot, you know. So, yeah, we use heuristics. I think that's what I was kind of getting at when I said like all of this is evolved, so it works well enough. Like our minds are not optimized. Our minds are satisficed, right? So our minds don't work perfectly. They work good enough. This is my cognitive science side coming out against the armchair sort of perspective of most philosophers. I just don't like. Yeah, okay. Content externalism appears to be prima facie incompatible with first person access. Yeah, okay, fine. Tell me something I don't know. And also, I don't care. Um, that if that's the way it is, that's the way it is. Yeah, exactly, Paul. We wouldn't even need to be here, would we? If we had this really perfect access, we wouldn't need to do philosophy of mind, would we? Yeah, yeah. Like Liam, like for example, the way emotions can influence our thinking. Sometimes for the good, sometimes for the worse. That's another thing I sort of disagree with when it comes to like modern and contemporary approaches in philosophy. Up until the late 20th century, a lot of people thought emotions made us less rational. And no, actually they don't. At least not when they're working the way they're supposed to work. Um, yeah, you can have cognitive dissonance. Um, yep. Like Holly said, a lot of stuff is automatic. It's been automatized. You don't have to think about trying to understand the words I'm saying to you right now, right? Your brain just takes care of that for you. And like Holly, I'm okay with this. That's a little bit different from what we're talking about here in terms of where mental states get their meaning. But yeah, I think if I were to write a book on philosophy of mind and I had a chapter on mental content, I think I would actually talk a lot more about the extended mind hypothesis. Um, Nowadays, you hear this discussed in terms of 4E cognition. I'm actually going to put this in the chat uh, in case any of you want to read about it a little more. But on this, cognition is um, extended, embedded, enacted, and embodied. Yeah, Liam. Going to the gym, better remember to perspire while I'm there, right? No, luckily we don't need to do that. Imagine if we had to remember to breathe all of the time. We would have no mental resources to where like I'm making supper, I'm concentrating so hard on getting the recipe right that I pass out forgetting to breathe. Like no, this is why automaticity evolved, right? Um, but yeah, this is related to 4E cognition. So cognition, this is, can I don't know if I'm getting this in the right order, but cognition is extended like outside of the bounds of the organism. It's embodied, so it also takes place within the bounds of the organism, but outside of the brain. Um, those organisms are embedded in dynamic physical environments, and we also inactively perceive the world. We don't Perception isn't something that like passively happens to us. It's an active process that we actively do, right? So that's 4E cognition. If I were to write a chapter on mental content, I would include a lot more discussion of this, as well as this as Stephen Harnad's discussion on the symbol grounding problem as it's related to Searle's criticisms of the Turing test, with the Chinese room. But that's me. Like I said, I think Kim is working from a bit of a different perspective here. And I don't think anything he's done in this chapter is bad. Not at all. Like, this is an excellent chapter. I couldn't write this chapter. Um, but the chapter that I would write would probably be a little bit different. I would use a different approach. Working memory, yes, it could. So, working memory, you might have heard the example of the expert bartender. I like to use the example of the expert bartender. An expert bartender does not need to write down a large order of drinks. Why? Well, um, because the expert bartender can use the environment as an external memory. So as I'm giving the order, like me and my friends all go to the bar and say, I want a glass of the house red. I want a pint of Guinness. I want a Manhattan and a fuzzy navel, right? Well, all of those drinks go in different glasses. So while I'm giving the order, the bartender's pulling out those glasses, pulling out the red wine glass, pulling out the Guinness glass, pulling out the little cocktail glass for the Manhattan, pulling out maybe a little tumbler sort of thing for the fuzzy navel, right? And so now, oh, what were the drinks? Oh yeah, I can see the glasses over there, right? So that's embodiment. You're using your body to alter the environment, which is the extended part. You're actively perceiving, right? You have to get right up close to listen through all the noise there, and all of this is happening in a dynamic environment. Yes, that's not to say that working memory is not in the head, but it's not just what's going on in the brain, right? It's also like within the organism and the environment and how the brain, the body, and the world are all hooked up and operating together. Another good resource if you want to learn more about all of this is this book, Mind, Body, World by Michael Dawson. Um, and if I'm not mistaken, you can still get this book for free, legally. Nothing fishy. There's no BitTorrents or anything like that. I think it was actually made available for free by the publisher. And it was used in some of my cognitive science classes when I was in graduate school. So I was in a class with Mark McLeod and Raj Singh, and they used this book for that class. And it was a very, very good book. And it's very much like 4E cognition. So I highly recommend it. Joshua says, just before we go, I'm going to stop sharing the screen. Kind of unrelated to the conversation, so feel free to answer it after. But I wanted to make sure I asked it before class ended. I have a question about the proposal to essay conversion. Oh, okay, yeah, yeah. Um, If, as my thesis statement for my proposal, I say, I'm arguing that this thing is likely not possible, and then after my proposal, when I'm researching further, writing that I'm changing my mind. Oh, I see. Can I change the thesis? Yeah, you can. You can make changes. Absolutely, absolutely, you can make changes, and that's fine. If it's a really major change, um, let let us know. Like, let whoever marked your proposal know, because chances are whoever marked your proposal is also going to mark your essay. So if it's like a really big change, like a completely different topic, let us know. But if you just make little tweaks, like you go from a positive to a negative argument, it's no big deal. That's fine. I'm going to try and post reflection assignment 2 later tonight. Um, yeah. And it won't be that different. Basically, what assignment 2 is going to be about, it's going to be very similar to reflection assignment 1. But instead of asking about like why you're here and what you hope to learn about, I'm going to ask you to pick something you've learned about in class and sort of critically engage with it. So part 1 will be like describe, say you want to talk about, I don't know, machine functionalism. Part 1, describe machine functionalism. Part 2, critique it. Is it good? Is it bad? Is it a little of both? Why? Tell me. And that's basically assignment 2. That's basically what it's going to be. And I will make that available this evening. So the template will go in the helpful materials module, and the Dropbox will appear in the final, like next week's module, basically. Yeah. So it's pretty straightforward. Well, that's everything for today. I have to leave the meeting open because I'm going to meet with our teaching assistants at 5:25. But you can all leave. Feel free to just leave. Um, yeah, yes, we're working to have, so the latest will be the last day of class. We are working very hard to get it done before then, but the latest will be the last day of class. And then that way you have the exam period to write your essay. You can also start writing your essay now and then just retroactively apply our feedback. But yeah, that's what we're aiming for. Since the essay is a final take home, the idea is you write it over the exam period. But yeah, if we can get you the feedback before then, we will. Okay. Okay. Well, I'll see you all next week. We're going to talk about consciousness. So please read, Kim. I believe it's chapter 9. Yes, chapter 9. Read chapter 9. And this is going to be fun because I love talking about consciousness. So have a good weekend, everybody. We'll see you next time.